And at these games, as I'm watching closed circuit television, I see a gentleman who's on the long jump runway, and he is an above the knee amputee. And I had never seen a person who was an above the knee amputee looking like myself running down the long jump runway before, leg over leg. It was a nuance. And I was intrigued. And as the entire crowd was cheering for him and clapping for him, he hits the takeoff board at full stride, leaps into the air, and at the apex, the height of his flight, his artificial leg flies off. And he lands in the sand here, and his artificial leg lands about 3 feet up in front of him, and the entire crowd goes dead silent. And as I'm looking at this, I'm trying to figure out what's happening. The long jumper turns back to the official and then says in a loud voice, "So where are you going to measure my jump from? From right here, my artificial leg landed up there." And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's a brilliant attitude to have." And I realized that I don't need to be in the swim venue. It began to really shift my perspective of who I need to show up as. And I think that's the beginning of our conversation, is around shifting our perspective. Because when we think about tolerance and we think about acceptance, they're really hierarchical. And as we frame this conversation today, we need to begin to shift our mindset from tolerance and acceptance, because if it's hierarchical, I only allow you into my space and my world if I choose to, because it's on my terms, on my conditions. And I did a TEDx talk on it that you can find out on YouTube as well, called Why Tolerance is Not Valuable. So look at that real quick, if you can, when you get a moment. But what we're going for is that tolerance and acceptance does not equal value and appreciation. In fact, what I found, and I'll cut the share off right now, what I have found is this, that when we are in a space of coming into a nuance and coming into something that is different for us, we often begin to resist it until we're kind of slapped in the face with it. And what's waking up and going on around this case right now. So the facts of the hour are this, we want to give you current data and get you to understand what is going on in our society from a factual standpoint, but also from a very personal standpoint. We invite you to hear the stories from our perspective. This is real talk. You have to hear the stories to know that these are not isolated incidents. Just because a negative situation has not happened to you does not mean that other citizens have not experienced that negative situation in their lives. And as far as the engagement, I'm so proud of my daughter that she did this up close and personal protest, the first peaceful protest that was in Denver, Colorado. And I want her to walk you through that process of how they actually did that after 3 days of escalation, how they actually managed to do that, and how we can, and you can as allies, begin to understand that. One of the things I found this, I'm on a board of directors for the Amputee Coalition, and we're trying to craft this statement that's going out. One of the things that I find is that many people that are crafting these statements to stand in solidarity with the African American community or people of color community in the United States, they say it in a way that says, we support you, but leaves out the reason why. And we want to make sure that we are also supporting the people who are at the target of what the problem actually is. It's kind of like if you have children and the two children get in a fight and the one kid gets a bloody nose and comes to you and says to you, "Mom, Dad, little Johnny hit me in the nose and my nose is now bleeding." And then you say, "Oh, I empathize and I feel your pain with that. So let's move on and let's really think about this more and let's have more conversation about that." It totally negates what happened in that moment. And so we begin to go with the victim and not the person that actually caused the injury. So we want to make sure that we are, as allies, pushing into that space and saying, no, it's great to identify, yes, it's great to identify with the Black community, but we also need to call out what caused this in the first place. And so holding people's feet to the fire, we call keeping the wood on somebody, is just equally important. And finally, we will have the promised 10 action steps that you can do as allies to actually engage with the African American community. So we don't police bash, right? It's not about that at all. We just want to call out some of the behaviors that are going on that are making us have these conversations today and help us get our arms around it. Our desire is to hold the police accountable for their actions. We desire to never have another life murdered at the hands of an officer. And we desire that all good police that we hear about not allow their partners to do that. And there are specific ways in which you can call that out in that. So this is a chalk talk forum. It's like when you're in the blackboard and you were in school and you have a chalk talk. We don't have a blackboard, but we'll make the best do without one. So the number one reason we are here is the entire world saw Mr. George Floyd, a man in his mid-40s, killed by Derek Chauvin, a now arrested former police officer charged with second-degree murder, and the people that were standing around doing it. So I have a question for Ash. You know, the number two reason is because of social media. Why are we here because of social media?
Everything is recorded now. We have video cameras, and social media is just a platform. All the platforms in social media just give everyone a quick snapshot of things that are happening around the world, even if you're not in that particular space. And the way that information moves through social media is just astronomically fast, right? So we see not only George Floyd, but you have to also think of my generation grew up watching from Trayvon Martin all the way to George Floyd. And we've seen, we've heard recordings, we've seen different videos. And so we are actually really traumatized, and that traumatization is going to carry on to further generations just because of the things that we have seen on social media. And I think it's also due to, in part, the times that we're also living in. COVID-19 really just disrupting the lives of a lot of people. A lot of people being unemployed, not having a means of or a source of income, and kind of just being on their last straw, if you will. And so when you are down to that bottom level and you have nothing else to lose, that's when you act out in different ways possible. And we've seen that, and those are some things that we're going to touch on as well.
That's great. And so, and the third reason why we're here is because many allies have been asking us how can they support. There are two questions that I get all the time. A, how am I feeling? And number two, what can I do as an ally to support, right? So we'll get to the how I'm feeling a little bit later in this conversation, but we'll move into, you know, shifting that perspective.
So another thing that we're going to be talking about after we get the polling underway is obviously action steps, right, that we can take from this. And two of my big ones are policy and culture. Policy one, because I mean, obviously we do need policy changes, law changes to get things done, but at the same time, we have been doing that. We have been doing that for hundreds of years, and we are still in the same position that we have been in. And so that's why I think culture is a big part of it, and that's why we're having this conversation today. Because you can't policy brotherhood, you can't policy sisterhood, you can't policy love. These are all things that we have to take initiative and kind of cultivate in our own homes, our own communities. And so these are some action steps that we'll be talking about, but that's a big part of it. Just the culture of kind of what's going on and how we can change that culture. Because culture really does run our society. And so I think that is the biggest takeaway.
Absolutely. And so what we'll do is, I'm not going to do that because I think I have to restart another system on the Mentimeter. So here's the question we'll put in the chat box. One is, how many people did police officers kill in 2019? These are kills in 2019. How many used deadly force? So do you think it's A, between 1 and 500? Do you think it's B, between 501 and 1,000? Do you think it's C, between 1,001 and 1,500? Or do you think it's D, between 1,501 and 2,000? What do you think? Just put it in the chat box there. All right. And Tracy, what are some of the answers we're getting? A, B, C, or D? What are we getting? Hit your mute, Trace.
A lot of C's. I think C is the most common answer.
And C is the correct answer. Well, actually, D is the correct answer. It's between. It's just. I'm sorry. C is the correct answer. You're actually right. So yeah. So we see that these are kills that happen, and that's, we know that deadly force is sometimes absolutely necessary. But on the next question, Black and brown people were what percentage of those police kills in 2019? Is it A, 3%, B, 12%, C, 17%, or D, 24%?
D, lots of D's.
Awesome. Okay, so D is actually the correct answer. Very good. And so when you look at that, what is the percentage of the population that you believe is the makeup of the Black and brown population? How much do we make up?
15%.
They've got 13, 14, 15, 25, 30, 15, 20, 10, 25, 20. What do you think?
And 13% is the, as you said, 13% is the actual right answer with inside of that. So,
and that's why it's important to understand these statistics when we're talking about them, because someone could just Google how many Black people did the police kill in 2019, 24%, and then they jump to, well, it's only 24% of police killings, so it's not even that much. But you also have to remember that of that 24%, we only make up 13% of the entire population. And so for all of my statistical people out there, you can understand how, we all understand how stats can be skewed. And though I do like facts, and I think that facts are important, you can never fact check enough someone's personal experience and what they have gone through in their lifetime. And so I think that is just another thing to keep in mind. When someone is like, well, look at this statistic, or look at this statistic, or look at this statistic. You can't put a statistic on your life. You can't put a statistic on your personal experiences, because everyone's life is different. Everyone has unique experiences, and those things are ever changing. So.
Absolutely. And when we also look at this as that 1.3 Black people are 1.3 more times likely not to be armed during a stop than their white counterparts. So when we look, and officers know these data, right, Point? So why do we have the escalation all the time? We'll talk a little bit about that. So, Ashley, you have that question for me now, I think. As allies.
As allies, you must know the statistics as well. Knowledge is power. Activating on the knowledge is power. And so if you do want to find these statistics and more, you can go to mappingpoliceviolence.org.
And so that's the first one we want to share with you for allies, that you can actually find these stats that are out there to arm yourself with this information. And that, as Ashley said, mappingpoliceviolence.org is one place that you can go. So we have 9 more that we have promised to you that we will get to you on this. There are also ways to find out how your city is doing. And on that website, you can find out how your city is doing. We'll have some resources for you that way as well. So, Ashley, you can back up, or maybe back up the statement that you just co-hosted Mobilizing for George Floyd demonstration in Denver on Monday evening. Nearly 3,000 people showed up. You think you thought 1,000 people were going to show up? It was just like overrun. It was great. It was amazing. As a dad, I was really nervous about you going up there, and we had that conversation as well. But I had to also remember that this is your time, this is your generation, and just like your uncle, Gloucester, who was in charge of the March on Washington, and saw Medgar Evers alive, just like your grandfather, who was jailed in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, for voter registration, right? What made you want to get involved in putting on a protest, A, and B, what was the process you and your team took to ensure that it was going to be a peaceful demonstration?
Making me get involved, I feel like I've always been involved. From a time when I was little, we traveled a lot, and so my mom made it pertinent that wherever we traveled to, we would learn a Black history fact about that space that we were in. And so growing up, I was just really passionate about Black history and everything that encompasses. And when I went to college and I minored in Africana Studies, I learned, even with my mom's due diligence of trying to prepare me as much as she could, I still learned so much more that I had no idea about, that I didn't know about my own community. And so I think education is a huge part about that, and we're going to also talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, I've always been involved. I've always cared. I've always been passionate about the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when I saw the video, I was just outraged, like a lot of people were outraged, and wanted to do something. And there were also a lot of people that I knew personally on my Twitter timeline that were also expressing that they wanted to do something. And so I kind of just got everybody together and said, what are we gonna do? What is it gonna look like? And what is it gonna look like after we're done protesting? Because there's a lot of people who are just meeting up and protesting and going home. And that's fine, that's cool. We definitely do need stuff like that. But I think our protest was a little different because we knew that there were going to be action steps that we were going to take afterwards that were going to propel us into the policy and culture that I was talking about earlier. And so that was one thing. And I had a friend up in Greeley. He was the Black Student Union president last year. And he is a huge activist in the Northern Colorado community. And he really came in and helped us kind of organize ourselves and get ourselves together. We were very strategic in everything that we did, from the speeches to the celebration of Black joy, the celebration of Black life. We had poets come in and do poetry. We ended with like a big cookout kind of dance vibe, which was really fun. And we did the vigil. But yeah, so we had so many people who volunteered just to help us kind of do like look at safety routes, be our eyes on the outside looking in, kind of just helping us with all these things, because obviously we saw some protests that escalated into violent protests, right? And actually, if you've ever been to any of these protests, you would know that a lot of those instigators are actually the white allies that were not listening to the message of the Black people who were trying to speak, and kind of trying to take matters into their own hands. And so when there's a retaliation from a white ally, the consequences basically suffer back onto the Black community. And so that's where a lot of the videos come from. A lot of the videos that we see online specifically are about the riots and like the looting and fires and stuff like that, but we don't see what actually caused that. And you don't see that unless you're actually there, unless someone really cares enough to get the entire thing on video. And so that's why I think it's very important to distinguish the difference between protesters and rioters and looters, because there's two separate groups. And also I think it's important to note that as white allies, it's important to know that you will never understand what it's like to be Black in America. And so as an individual person, it's fair to say that we don't know how someone else is feeling, even within our own communities. I can't tell somebody else how to react to a certain situation if it's making them feel that certain type of way. And the protests, the rioting, the looting, all that it didn't just happen. It's a constant thing that has been built up generation through generation, time after time, and just a whirlwind of factors that cause an eruption. And once the top is off the lid, it's hard to contain it. And so I think it's just important to remember that you can't be about the Black Lives Matter movement and say, well, but I don't support the looting and the rioting, because for one, that's not just the Black Lives Matter movement. If it is any people who are doing that, from what I've seen with my own eyes personally, it's white allies, like I said, or it's police actually sending undercover cops in to kind of start these things and have it escalate and go to a next level.
So one of the things, and Ashley makes an amazing point, right, that you have to segment and separate. So what I have been telling those that have been asking how to help is to always steer the conversation back to the point of origin. Where's the scene of the crime? And when we begin to start splintering off, right, when we begin to start moving away from that, the message, the original message gets diluted. And that is exactly what people want. It's in the playbook. It's been going on. And rioting, nothing comes to the status quo to make change unless it's by force. We saw that. We can go all the way back to the founding of the United States of America, where, you know, the Boston Tea Party, the riots that happened there, because a group of the white colonists said that we don't want to be oppressed and enslaved by King George. And the British were saying, well, you're enslaved. Why don't, if you want to talk about being enslaved, why don't you ask the people that you're enslaving? So, you know, we got to look at that's going to be a part of it, because people will try to hijack the message. And so the original point of intent, second thing that can happen, is always pointed back to where you came in on the conversation. So for some, it'll be George Floyd. For others, like Ashley said, it'll be Trayvon Martin. For others, it might be Rodney King. It might be Breonna Taylor, right? Who's, if you don't know, was a nurse who was treating COVID-19 and was busted in on a drug raid into her apartment while she's recovering from treating everybody all night long, and she was shot. Police still have not been charged in that one, right? Or it could be 400 years ago. But wherever you come in on that conversation, you direct the conversation back to it, because protesters are not agitators. Agitators are not looters. They're different in that, but they lump them all together. And so let's go back to the original point. Why is there a protest? Oh, there's a protest because a black man was killed by an unarmed black man in handcuffs, was choked out for over 9 minutes, right? That's what we want to turn the conversation always to. So what do we do about the policing of that? That's always, and that's a hard conversation in some communities, because we have this political unrest that's within inside of our country right now. And there are still those that saw that videotape and said, if you think that's murder, I want you to leave the police force. And you had others saying that if you think that's murder, I want you to stay on the police force, right? So we still have, looking at this tape, some people still don't believe that was, some people believe that was still a justified murder, right? So that's where we're up against it daily. And when you start making change and calling mayors and sheriffs out on it, you are going to start stepping into what really, you know, we experience on a day-to-day basis. You're probably going to get some retribution for it from your peers, from your community. So just be ready as allies to, you know, you're going to have to you may have to take one on the chin for what you're standing up for. So I heard you say, Ash, always keeping the attention on the crime scene and not allowing a focal point to be hijacked. So we want to make sure that that is going on. And you talked about looters and vandals, right? But let's talk about a little bit more on knowing and seeing what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud. Have you personally felt the sting of racism? In what way? So what's some of those ways?
A lot of ways, actually. I think every Black person has that first kind of experience where they come to a realization that they're different, that they're not the same as everyone else. And so mine, the first incident that I can think of is when we would go home, go back to mom's home down in Crawfordsville, Arkansas, and all of my country cousins would be like, "You act so white, you talk so white." That's kind of like my first. I was like, what does that mean? Like, what are you talking about? This is who I am. And so that was kind of my first, like, what does it mean to be Black then, you know? And what kind of does that encompass? Not only that, but growing up, the first teacher that I had that was African-American or Black was in college. So growing up all throughout my secondary, the first education, all of my teachers have been white, and there have been some instances where they have made comments that were gaslighting comments, racist comments, comments like, well, how do you know that? Being someone who was very intelligent for my age growing up, there was a lot of disbelief as to why I was so smart. And a lot of my teachers didn't like that I was so smart. And being one of the only African-American kids in my class and surpassing everyone else, they didn't like that. there were times in high school where my principal would punish me for doing something, but not punish the white kids doing the same thing. A specific instance that I can recall is we had a policy where you had to you couldn't show your shoulders, so you had to have like a jacket on. But we had 2 different campuses at my high school, so a lot of times during lunchtime, if it was nice outside, we would sit outside. And this particular day was very hot, so I had my jacket off of my shoulders, kind of just sitting like that. And then I was walking to class, and as I was walking to class, I was still outside, mind you. There was 2 white girls in front of me who had spaghetti straps on, and they walked right past my principal, and she didn't say anything. But as soon as I walked up to her, it was a whole problem as to why I didn't have my jacket on. Why was I disobeying the dress code policy? And so I called her out on it. I said, you literally just watched those 2 white girls walk past you and they had spaghetti straps on. And now that you see me doing it, it's a problem. So if you don't have an adequate reason as to it, I'm going to assume that you're a racist. And then she was like, no. And so that's one instance. The other instances, it was in college. There's multiple, but in college, when I was running track and field, we have this thing called Halloween relays, where we do a 4x4, but we basically do it in Halloween costumes. So it's like a fun little thing to do. In this particular group that I was with, we were all people who identified as Black or African American. And so we decided to dress up as a Black Panther Party. And so when we came to the track that day, one of my coaches said, what are y'all supposed to be, hood rats? And it's comments like that are like, they take you back and they bring you back to reality. Like, yep, I am looked at differently in this society because of the color of my skin.
You talked a little bit about gaslighting. What is that? Gaslighting
comments are, you talk so white. You're so pretty for a Black girl. They're not really comments. They're not really positive comments. They're saying that you have to be altered in some type of way to be seen as approved by, because you're Black. You can't just be Black and be who you are and be accepted as that. You have to be pretty for a Black girl. You have to be someone who can speak eloquently, someone who can write very well, who can read very well, who's very intelligent. And that kind of separates you from everybody else. Those are comments that are gaslighting. You're just basically saying that you are not accepted as your whole self.
That's interesting because, I've had those comments as well with somebody saying, oh, you're not like those Black people, right? From some white kind of, what does that even mean? And we see these, and they're really, we call them now microaggressions. And those microaggressions are really harmful. Because they don't take into account that person's full self of who they actually are and how they show up in society. So, as Ashley has had to share with you her own experiences, I've had some experiences too, and I'm going to just share them really briefly with you, just so you can kind of hear the struggle that is ongoing. And I know I show up in most, some of the folks that are on it right now, I show up in very, positive and upbeat, and I always will, because I think I'm not going to allow other people to have that power over me. I choose to live life as I choose, but I'm very I'm very aware of my surroundings. And I'm very aware of those surroundings for others, because I know that these are real atrocities that happen. And so, from being called the N-word, absolutely. From being spit on out of a window in an open bus and called the N-word, absolutely. But having things thrown on me as I'm walking home from school, absolutely. And then call the N-word and run away. To my first story I want to share with you is buying my first bicycle. So I was a guard at the Ridgeland Common Pool in Oak Park, Illinois. It's awesome. And I had my first job, and I wanted, at the end of that job, I had my eye on a Schwinn, black Schwinn, Continental black and gold bicycle. It was up on Oak Park Avenue and Randolph. And every week I went up there to check to see if the bike was still there. And I raised enough money, earned enough money to actually buy that bicycle. And I went up there, bought a huge lock, had a lock around my neck, and the guy was beaming because he saw me coming there all the time. Gave me the bike, I gave him the money for the transaction, rode the 8 blocks back home to my house, crossed over Ridgeland Avenue, and as soon as I got onto my block, woo, cop car behind me. And if you have to know, I'm about to turn into my alley. And he gets out, I kind of pull out, I think he wants to pass me, I think he wants to go by. But he actually stops, and the first question out of his mouth after he told me to get off the bike says, Where did you steal that bike from, boy? First question. Where did you steal that bike from, boy? So fortunately, Mr. Jones, one of our neighbors in the next block over, he was working on his car, saw what was going on, and he came out and he intervened as I was being accosted by this I just bought the bike. I got this bike from work and earning. And I've been telling all my friends around the block, and they all knew that I was working to get this bicycle. Everybody knew. And so Mr. Jones went in on the police officer and said, he's been working at Ridgeland Commons all summer long to earn that bike, and you are not going to harass him on this. And so as he backed down from that confrontation because Mr. Jones had come over, he left me with the parting words of, well, just be careful where you ride it. How many of you have ever had a police officer tell you, just be careful where you ride that bike? If it wasn't for a safety issue, safety from being stopped and harassed again, because I'm a black person, black kid on a bike. And then it goes to driving a car, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. So that's an experience that tells me that I am being treated differently. The second experience was in Weebolts on Harlem Avenue as well. My white friend Michael Ryan and I were about 14 years old. We wanted to go get a Father's Day card. It was right around this time. And so we went down to Weebolts, down the escalator to go get a Father's Day card, but we didn't see anything that we liked. So he went out up the escalator across the street. And I stayed down there to peruse some more cards. Still didn't see anything I liked. And I went back up the escalator to go find Mike across the street. And before I got out, a plainclothes police officer got me, took me by the collar, threw me up against the window and said, he spread me eagle, began frisking me up and down my body and said, boy, you know where you're going to when I find something on you, don't you? I'm 14 years old, no parent around, just walking down the street. In those days, you could just walk to the store. And I'm being traumatized, and there's a glass outside. So everybody that can see me against the front, and what's the assumption? Oh, that kid must have done something really bad. He's probably a thief. That's why this police officer, this person of authority, has him and spreading him eagle and frisking him. So again, another black person doing something wrong in our community. Good job, officer. That's what the people probably thinking as they walk away or walk by. How many times have you seen young black and brown boys and girls on the ground, handcuffed behind their back, and the assumption is they must have done something wrong. We just told you that the stats say that most people of color do not have a weapon on them. Most people of color do not have that situation happening in their life. And we are less part of the population with the greatest instance of stops. The final story I say around that is my father told me how to drive a car, or rather how to get pulled over when I got pulled over. He didn't say if I got pulled over, he said, when you get pulled over, this is how you act. Think about how you go if you have children, if you had this conversation with them. And I said the same thing I had to do with Ashley, that your hands need to be attended to. You need to make sure that you have your registration and driver's license and everything outside of the glove compartment so you're not reaching over to the glove compartment to take it out. Make sure it's in plain view. If you ask, you're full within your rights to ask the officer why you were stopped, but know that that's going to escalate the situation. So make sure that you are just totally respectful, and that might not even save your life. So let's fast forward now to me as a father, having that conversation with my daughter. Me as a father, when my son in a beat up Mercedes-Benz 2002 that had a good motor in it, he's going down to college, I have one of my fraternity brother police officers actually walk around the car to make sure that everything is in operation, it works well, that the tags can be seen, that the rear view mirror and the back of the window there's nothing, no obstructions, that the turn signals work, the headlights are working. And I said, John, when you get into Texas, you are going to be stopped more than likely. And at that moment, 6 hours later, after this car has been checked out, I get a call from my son. They said, Dad, I'm being pulled over. I just got into Texas. Not more than 20 minutes that he was in there. Black man driving a Mercedes-Benz in Texas. What do you think I'm doing in my bed right now as he has a telephone on? I am fearful for his life because I don't know what state at 1 o'clock in the morning as he's just driving back to school that this officer is in. And as I'm on the phone and hearing the conversation, he's being totally respectful to the officer. He has his paperwork out and he said, well, some that's inaudible, but just a fictitious stop, random stop. And so I couldn't breathe again until he left that scene and he was all right. Because I had to get ready to jump in my car and try to find out where he was if he was detained. Very possible. If he was choked out, told to get out of the car. For what reason? And put on the ground and have a knee in the back of his neck because he fits the description, just to strike fear into somebody. That is a real conversation that my father had with me, that I have with my children. I hope that my children do not have to have with theirs. But it goes from generation to generation, and that is a real press upon us in society. So right now we're going to take a quick little break, and Tracy, my amazing assistant, is going to look in the chat, because I know that you all have been chatting about some stuff, and pull out a few questions that we can answer real quick before we go into the second part of our discussion and get ready to wrap up. So go ahead, Trace.
Okay, we have some here. How do you propose that people concentrate their movement in writing to their local and state representatives? One
awesome.
Letter and signatures, online and/or real, individual letters, common narrative, or other means?
Yeah, so we have a few links to some petitions that you can sign, and organizations that you can donate to. Activism looks different across the board. Not everyone wants to be on the front lines protesting. Not everyone wants to be going to town hall meetings because they're boring. But there's a multitude of ways that you can help. I think a good first step is just to find out who your state representative is, because it starts locally and it goes up. That's the thing about politics. It starts low and then we go up, and that's kind of how we get things done. So if you're into going to town hall meetings, or just calling your representative, calling your local city councilman, finding out who your state senators are, and just look at the bills that they're on, and the bills that they're proposing, the ones that they are in favor for, and that will kind of give you a good starting point. Like for us, I just found out who our state representative was this past weekend. He hasn't said anything about what has been going on in our community. And you're representing a district in Colorado that has a lot of Black and brown people. So why aren't you being held accountable in that sort? And so the organization that I'm actually working with now, that's kind of our main focal point, is to enact and keep systemic racism at the forefront of conversation through policy and culture, by doing civic engagement and education. And so the civic engagement part definitely comes from me going to these town hall meetings and speaking up and saying why we need certain things in place. And so I see your heart. And so I think, yeah, so locally, that's a good first action step, I would say, to take.
And someone in the post has posted a link to find your legislator. So that's really
awesome.
So there's a comment: wow, you've raised such a wonderful daughter. Would you speak a little bit about parenting Black and brown kids?
Absolutely. So it's a challenge, because you want them to experience their own life. And as they do that, there are going to be certain things that are going to pop up, and you have to prepare them for that. At the same time, let them have their identity. I think we first started on this call today, on this Zoom call today, I was sharing with how I was really a little fearful. I was fearful for Ashley as my daughter, when she was starting to become this activist and go up and start this entire thing. So I was having conversations like, did you talk to the police? Did you get your permit done? Did you? So I'm doing all these things because that's coming from a dad. And I have to understand and realize that I have to let her go in this space, because she's doing it for the right reason. And I have to not be okay with the consequences, but understand what the consequences are. I know that there is a time, and I would never dread getting a call that she's been detained, that something has happened. I'd be devastated. But I know that she's on the wall, and she's doing it for, these when you look at civil rights, right, and every other activist group that came after civil rights modeled their their movement on the civil rights movement, right? So whether it's gay, lesbian, LGBT community, whether it's disability community, whoever is demanding rights from those that would have the status quo have modeled it off the civil rights movement. And so there was a lot of anger and hatred and that spilled over to change laws. But as Ashley said so eloquently earlier, that laws do not necessarily equate to the culture shifts that we have to make. It can I'll talk a little bit about Dr. Harry Edwards in a moment, but it doesn't really equate to that all the time. So raising children is to, we had a great time making sure that as a father, as a mother, my wife, we made sure our children, when we went places, as Ashley said, that we went to museums and we learned a little about the history or the culture of that area. And we saw how Black folks fit into those areas as well. So when Ashley talks about at 3 years old, because she went to Sydney, Australia to watch me do the long jump in Sydney, and she comes back home and they asked the question in her, her kindergarten class, and they're doing little pictures and drawings about where did you go this summer and what was your best experience? And she says, I went to a Sydney. And she begins to draw the medal and those things around. And the teacher comes out to the bus asking us, your daughter has a really vivid imagination. She said she went to Sydney, Australia. Wow, that's a great imagination. Where did she get that from? So what 4-year-old or 5-year-old kid makes something up like that? Where do they get that in their head to make something up? Number one, why does the teacher not believe her that she's gone just because you haven't gone? Well, we took her. Absolutely, she went. So you asked her what the question was. The question was, where did you go? She told you Sydney, Australia. End of story. Oh, that's an amazing trip. Why don't you tell us more about that, Ashley? Don't come running out to the bus and asking us. Your child has a very, very vivid imagination. Come on now. That's a struggle, and we always have to do that. So I am always pushing teachers in the system, and when I fight for my children, I'm not saying they did everything right, but I am saying that if somebody threw the first punch, let's punish that person for throwing the first punch. Don't punish the person that reacted. Maybe they could have handled the situation better, but somebody threw the first blow, and you're just letting them off the hook, and you're only focusing on you're not even focused on the victim. You're not even dissing it. If there was a person, and I'm not sure if they're on here or not, that was say a woman who was accosted by her husband, right, in a domestic violence situation, and that woman is beat up and bloody. This is a real scenario that happened to my son, beat up and bloody, and she can't get out to work, and she has to, we see her face. If we just came up to her and said, oh, I empathize with you. I really feel sorry for what happened. I'm emotionally connected to who you are. Why don't we advocate for your, for what happened to you? And we never address the person that punched in the face. It's the same thing, right? We advocate for people, and we don't go to the scene of the crime, of what actually happened. We had all these, I think it was Amazon, it was Disney. I saw all these statements from these CEOs that empathize with the Black community, but never calling out why they're empathizing with them. And I'm doing that with my board. I have a board that I'm on, and I'm calling them out on it too, because they're about to release a statement. I said, no, we're going to call out the action, because if we don't, we're cowards, is what I'm saying. We got to go there. And so why can't we go there? So from there, we're going to jump into, we're going to begin to shift the conversation. Ashley has a question for me, I think. We got our sheets of paper.
Okay, so how did you become educated on the issue concerning Black and brown?
Well, it's an ongoing process. And one of the things I will say is I was asked to be a speaker for the SOS class, the Squadron Officer School for the United States Air Force. And I went to Alabama to do this class. Found out I was the only, this class are for captains who are about to take over commands. And I found out I was the only person of color that has spoken to them the entire class. So I was kind of, that was interesting. But as I, looked at my history and going back on my education, I saw that my uncle, as I said earlier, in charge of March on Washington, last person to see Medgar Evers alive. I looked at my dad and him being jailed in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and then the change that they caused, right? So the judge that jailed my father for over 10 days with some white clergy that were down there as well, the change that they made actually now had a black female judge in that same courthouse who wanted to expunge his record. He said, no, I'm gonna keep my scars there, right? It shows I was in the fight. And so in this moment, it was right at the same time that Colin Kaepernick was taking a stand for Black lives that were being snuffed out in police custody as they were handcuffed. And of course, the conversation was hijacked, and we all know how the conversation got hijacked. So I was asked that question directly as the only Black person on the stage of what my thoughts were about that. And so it's really good to be armed with the education and the history to begin to articulate to these leaders. That said, number one, you cannot be in that fight because you're leading people, and you can't be divisive. You have to lead the conversation. So let's see how we do it. We all know that Colin Kaepernick was not kneeling, or when he was not in the NFL. NFL players were not the first kneelers. So let's go back in history. In our country, the first kneelers were in 1776 when they started firing rifles into their brethren from the British, right? That's how we fought. We knelt and fought into the fire lines. And it was because the flag of what we were waving. So don't tell me that there was no protest and some fighting of kneeling. So that was number one. But then we got to walk through the stretching of our democracy. And the stretching of our democracy is that the founders, even Thomas Jefferson, they even though they were trying to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it wasn't for all citizens. He had a brother-in-law that was in the room that was a slave because of his other brother who had relations with another slave, and that was really his brother-in-law that's in the room being his kind of valet, and he knows that what he's writing is not for his entire family. So 1619 Project, that's another thing we're going to talk about. So as we're moving through, we have the 13th Amendment, which I guess is the emancipation. But there's a clause in the 13th Amendment that says everybody's free, except if you are put into the criminal justice system. So what happens? All these slaves are freed, but there's got to be some people that's got to rebuild the South. So we arrest loiterers and put them in chain gangs to help rebuild roads, bridges, and those type of things. And that's when our police system gets even worse. We have the voting rights for women, 19th Amendment, right? It's all the stretching of our democracy. And I said, and you have the Tuskegee Airmen, you said are the best fighting force that's ever been around. They sacrificed themselves, their planes, their lives to ensure that white lives came back home from the bomber runs that went to Berlin. And yet when they came back to an atrocity. Because they were called uppity when they got back in their military uniforms, proud to serve their country, we know that over 5 of them were lynched in their military uniforms. Were those the same ones lynched by the same people who were coming back home, that their lives were saved by those individuals, and now their families were able to move forward in life because they sacrificed their life for those that didn't even want them in the country? So it's all those things that led up to this, and we have to take in the whole picture. Again, go back to the point of embarkation.
Okay, and so how can allies become more educated on the issues concerning Black and Brown people?
That's a great question. I think it's doing things like this. And I'm sure that every one of you has been reaching out to friends in your communities and trying to understand, because we're at a point right now where we've all had COVID-19 and we've been isolated. We're at home. We're more attuned to watching things on our smart devices and phones, and we're not traveling around the world. We're not busy. And so when we see something like that, now we can wake up to that. So I think the first one is waking up. The second thing is to begin to take action, whatever action that is. Action takes form in many places, and we're going to start moving into our, what are those specific actions that you can take right now, because we did promise you that before the end of the hour, and the hour's starting to get towards the end. So Trace, are there any more questions in there that Ashley might be able to answer? And we're going to begin to do the wrap up.
There was one about what you think, let's see, let me read it. What do you think would be a more effective and permanent approach to tackling racism in the U.S.? It seems like it never went away from the days of slavery. It just takes on different forms. clearly the attempts to address racism via policies are not working well. How can we fix the current racism in the country, and how can we ensure that it doesn't happen again?
You want to take a stab?
Sure. Like I said, culture, changing the culture of our country. And so as allies, you guys are all here because you want to know what you can do to aid in this movement. And like I said earlier, I think it's important to understand, one, education is important, but know that you will never educate yourself to a point where you can understand fully what Black people go through in America. And two, kind of doing a self-reflection on who you are as a person, and not being shameful of if you did have some of these biases, if you did have some of these prejudices about people of color or Black and brown people. I don't like using people of color because we are not the same. But anyways, that you understand what those prejudices are, and I think acknowledging it is the first step. And once you can acknowledge the ways that you have aided into the systemic racism in this country, that's a good starting point. And not to be shameful of that, but to take those experiences, take those thoughts, and really unlearn a lot of those processes that have been ingrained in you for your whole life, and you weren't even aware that they were ingrained in you. And having those tough conversations with family members that you may know that don't understand the movement or that are completely against it. Having those conversations within your own communities, because we won't always be there. We won't always be there to advocate for ourselves. And so that's when we really need you guys to come in and advocate for us and challenge your ideals and challenge your thoughts, because it's the first time that you will really have to do that, because it's a whole community that is experiencing things that you have never experienced before. There's a huge misconception that slavery was bad, racism was bad, and then the civil rights movement happened and then everything was fixed. And that's not the case. The civil rights movement was actually passed 3 times, if you guys didn't even know that. And so, like I said, it's institutionalized, it's systemic, and it's flooded in so many ways that it's so unimaginable. And so, yeah, I think I actually saw a video the other day of this teenage white girl really having a heated argument with her parents about the Black Lives Matter movement, and she was really just advocating for everything that we are advocating for. And I think that's another important thing, is to listen, not only listen, but my mom says this thing, I know you're listening, but did you hear me? And so really making sure that people are engaging in conversation and are opening their mind to learning new things, because that's what this is. And it's not going to be like oh, I did this and so now that's done. This is an ongoing thing. And I think now more than ever is when a lot of white allies are trying to figure out how they can help, but also understand that just because it's broadcast now doesn't mean that this is the only time that this has happened. Black people have been dealing with this under the radar for years on years on years. Like he said, it's generational. And so stepping into those roles and just seeing what you can do personally from your own standpoint. If that just means that you change one person, then that's one more person that we have on our side that can change more people. And so we need those hard conversations to be had from your standpoint, through education, through empathizing, and through all these things.
Absolutely. The other thing with that is, to tag on what you said, is think about Derek Chauvin's arrest or the murder of George Floyd, right? So we go one way. We went to the way of the protests and protest rights, writers and all these other things, right? We don't go back the other way. George Floyd was murdered. We have the second-degree murder on it, right? So how about opening up all the cases of Black and brown people that Derek had in the past and say how many were unjustly treated at the hands of this person? So we don't go that way. We don't go in that way and demand that every person that comes up on charges or has done something like this have their records looked at, so we can really see who was part of the needed to be arrested and who didn't, based upon what this one person's tainted view is. So we're going to jump now into the promise that we wanted to give you. So the first one for me, and we'll kind of go on each one individual, is Ashley was talking about familiarizing yourself, mappingpoliceviolence.org. There's another one, which is called 8can'twait.org, 8can'twait.org. And we will, those are one, we will help get this 8can'twait.org. And so this is our 8 things that police forces, mayors can do right now. They don't need any type of group to tell them that they can do this, or they don't need to go to anybody. They can just, with one fell swoop of the pen, put these 8 things in place. And we know that the data proves that when you put these 8 things in place, the police violence goes down by 72%. It's proven, stat facts, right? And so we've got to ask ourselves the question, why won't they do it? That's the next one. That's the harder conversation. Chokeholds and strangleholds is 1. Require de-escalation, that's 2. Require warning shots before shooting people, that's 3. Require exhaustive and alternatives before shooting. Duty to intervene, so police that are intervening when they see excessive force being used by their partner. Ban shooting at moving vehicles. Require use of force continuum. This limits the type of weapons that can be used to respond to specific things of resistance. And then require comprehensive reporting. Why would you want to have a comprehensive report? So those 8 things can reduce police violence by 72%. But if you look on that website, you can look at your own county, your own place, and you will find that maybe 2 to 3 are done in your community. Why not the rest? And that's where the tough conversation will begin. Ashley.
Like I said earlier, another thing you can do is have a direct family talk and talk about the murder of George Floyd and hear what others have to say, especially children, and ask questions, ask open-ended questions, make sure that the questions are leading into the next thing so you guys can understand like where the roots of thoughts and feelings are coming from.
And then the next thing is to listen as a family to the podcast 1619 Project. It's really well done by the New York Times. And it's on a podcasting device, and demand your schooling system begin teaching the full unadulterated history of the United States. So that's another thing.
Watch the documentary 13th on Netflix if you haven't already. That just really dives into the 13th Amendment that my dad was talking about earlier. And it really gives you the history of everything, like start to where we are now today, and how the 13th Amendment is really just a detriment to the Black community.
And then self-reflect on family history. So look at your family history. I had a conversation with a gentleman that's over in England, and he's from New Orleans, and father owned slaves. And so they had a whole rift in their family about that. And he grew up, and he's doing amazing work right now as an ally that's actually changing the entire Commonwealth culture and all the lands that were once under the British rule. It's actually an amazing thing what he's doing. So it's phenomenal. He was on my podcast. His name is David Grevenberg. So if you go to the podcast, Life's New Normal podcast, it's on iTunes, and find the David Grevenberg one. That is another great. That's another great one to do.
Read the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, and that is by Ibram X. Kendi. That's a good book, especially it's very relevant to our times as well. And
the one we did, How to Be an Anti-Racist, that's another great book for reading as well. That's a one, okay. And then self-reflect on family history, what I said. Then White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Betty McIntosh. And then Code Switching on NPR. And then finally, read The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, the Age of Colorblindness. I thought I saw Kat Coppett on the call today too. She also put on there, I have a resource I would like to share with her permission that she put out for white allies as well. So it was a really great comprehensive document, and we will make that available. I think everybody that registered, we should have your email address, and if you want that, we will send that out to you. As Kat said, she'll put the link into the chat box. So those are actually 12 things we gave you. So we actually gave you more than what you bargained for here today. I hope that's been good. If you want to, please put in the chat box, did you learn something today from this conversation? Did you learn something new? And then secondly, will you activate in some way on it? So just put that in the chat box on a kind of accountability thing. I was going to do it on the Mentimeter, but it's not up and working. So Ashley and I were very happy to have this chat with you today. If this has been of value, we want you to put some skin in the game on it, right? So this was a free Zoom meeting. We want to, keep it that way. We want people to have the conversation, but we all know that free is treated with less urgency. But if you got some information out of it, make an investment. Ashley's trying to get to law school. If this added value to your life, make an investment. I'm not going to tell you how much. You determine the worth of this for you. I'm going to insert my Cash app in the chat. If you can copy it and just share it with anybody else. That was just for your allies. It's the $ John F. Register, $ John F. Register. Somebody can put that in there. But that's just the, put some skin in the game on that as well. And if you do that, we're going to make sure that Ashley does get to law school, so it doesn't come out of my pocket, it comes out of your pocket. So secondly, Ashley has another thing she wants to share with you.
If this has been valuable to you, you can share this video with others. My dad's going to post it on his YouTube, right, for a while. And you can listen to it again, or you can share it with your friends, talk to your families, talk to your children, watch it together, and stop the violence.
Yeah. I have a podcast entitled Life's New Normal. Please go and subscribe on it. We have a lot of conversation on how to overcome adversity with people that have gone through and are now teaching others how to go through as well. Big shout out to my big cousin Hubert Register on the call over in France. Thank you, brother, for being on. Appreciate it. Finally, when we return to the workplace and you see something that is wrong, say something. That's the biggest thing. Just don't let stuff slide, because sliding is commiserate with silence, and silence drives the action. And it's tough sometimes to be the sore thumb. I mean, I was doing it in my last job, and then and I was released from the job. So sometimes it happens, but then you just move on with life. You just push in that space. The number one reason we're here in this talk is because of George Floyd. We want to make sure that we keep the pressure there on our elected officials, because we can have a voice to it. But remember, when you put skin in the game, sometimes you get a skin knee, and you might become a target for it. And that's when the fight really begins, when you start seeing the systemic racism that we have in our country. But we can all change it together, but it's not going to come without a fight. So thank you all. To my amazing daughter, Ashley, thank you for being on with me today.
Thank you, Dad.
And we will all chat with you a little bit later. Thank you so much. God bless each one of Clayton.